Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you with all the top news stories from around the globe, and there's also an exclusive interview coming up in half an hour. But for now, let's get started with our big focus. Britain is voting today in a general election that's widely expected to hand a landslide win to the opposition Labour, ending 14 years of Conservative rule. The first national election since Boris Johnson led the Tories to a decisive victory in 2019 follows Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's surprise call to hold the polls 6 months earlier than expected. The gamble might backfire spectacularly, as surveys point to a huge defeat for the right-wing party and almost certainly put Labour leader Keir Starmer in Downing Street with an almost supermajority. The UK operates under a first-past-the-post system where voters elect representatives from 650 constituencies. The party that wins most seats, at least 326, will form the government. Its leader will become the Prime Minister. In the case that no party secures a majority, the existing Prime Minister gets the first opportunity to form a coalition government. The main political parties in the fray include the Conservative Party, led by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the Labour, led by Keir Starmer, the Liberal Democrats, led by Ed Davey, the Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, the Scottish National Party, led by John Swinney, and the Green Party, co-led by Carla Denaya and Adrian Ramsay. Keir Starmer has hailed a new age of hope and opportunity as millions of people prepare to vote in a general election that could deliver the biggest shake-up of British politics in a generation. With Rishi Sunak's closest allies appearing to concede defeat for the Conservatives and the final opinion polls predicting an unprecedented Labour victory, Starmer has said he hopes Britain is about to enter a new chapter. On the last day of a fractious 6-week campaign, reports emerged that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had confided to members of his inner circle that he was fearful of losing his own seat in Richmond. A new YouGov poll has predicted that 16 cabinet ministers would lose their seats, potentially handing Starmer the biggest majority for any single party since 1832. Leading Tories, including the sacked former Home Secretary Suella Braverman and the Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride, have also made clear that election defeat appears inevitable. The Tories experienced yet another blow on Wednesday as the Rupert Murdoch-owned Sun newspaper made an abrupt volte-face, putting its support behind the Labour Party for the first time since 2005. After years of fiercely critical coverage of Labour and personal attacks on its leader, the Sun has now endorsed Starmer, saying it is time for a change, which means that it is time for Labour. The outcome would see Britain swing leftwards back to the centre ground after almost a decade and a half of right-wing Conservative governments dominated first by austerity, then Brexit and a cost of living crisis. Rishi Sunak has sought to hammer home his oft-repeated warnings that a Labour government would mean tax rises and weaker national security, jibes that Labour has branded a desperate attempt to cling to power.
40,000 polling stations opened across Britain on Thursday as voters made their choice in a parliamentary election expected to bring Keir Starmer's Labour Party to power. Pollsters predict Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservatives will be swept away after 14 often turbulent years. Sunak cast his vote early in his Northern English constituency alongside his wife. Opinion polls put Starmer's centre-left party on course for a landslide victory. 61-year-old Starmer also arriving at a London polling station with his wife to cast his ballot. In a statement, Starmer, the former chief prosecutor of England and Wales, said today Britain can bring a new chapter.
Thank you. Quite right.
Reform UK leader Nigel Farage soaked up the sun on a walkabout in his constituency of Clacton-on-Sea. Liberal Democrat Party leader Ed Davey arrived at a local church to cast his vote. Voters on London streets had mixed emotions.
I feel like every candidate's pretty awful, in all honesty. If I was going to vote for anyone, I'd vote for Labour, but I don't think any of them are particularly good choices.
I'm optimistic. I think it's been a pretty dreadful 10, 12, 14 years, so pretty optimistic.
Voting ends at 10 p.m. when an exit poll will give the first indication of the outcome. Official results are expected in the early hours of Friday.
Leo, what are some of the top issues that you've thought about before casting your ballot?
So in general, this country is in a far worse off position than it was 14 years ago when the Conservatives were voted into power. And what most people want, especially young people, they want change. They want a fresh style of leadership to try and bring this country forward through the challenges it faces. And that's the problems with the NHS, the health service. Problems with immigration. The Conservatives have been very bad on immigration. Labour will hopefully bring a brighter approach.
Well, Ollie joins us here in the Finchley, Golders Green area. Ollie, what are some of the local issues that you've kept in your mind before you head inside that room and cast your vote?
Well, if I'm being completely honest, this is really an election not about local issues as far as I can tell. Most people here are looking for a broader change across the country. You know, the winds have turned against the Conservatives and people want change. And broadly speaking, when we look around this constituency, the past 14 years don't seem to have served Finchley Golders Green everything that they've wanted. So it seems that people are choosing between the Liberal Democrats and Labour.
All right, so what should be made of these UK elections? Let's discuss this with our guests. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Professor Scott Lucas, Professor at the University College Dublin. He joins us live from Ireland, and Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian Ambassador to the United States. A warm welcome to both my guests. Professor Lucas, if I could begin with you. As I'm sure you're aware, exit polls in India were way off the mark this time because they'd all predicted an absolute majority for the ruling party. That didn't quite come to fruition. However, talking about the UK elections, poll after poll has suggested that not only are the Tories going to be routed, but that the wipeout could be so bad that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak could lose his own seat. As many as 16 cabinet ministers are likely to lose their respective constituencies, and the win and its margin could be so massive for Labour that it may well end up turning out to be the biggest majority for any single party in the United Kingdom since 1832. Professor Lucas, if you were to look into the crystal ball for us, do you believe that's where things are headed for the United Kingdom?
I would never want to make a firm prediction on what's going to happen in an election, but UK polls have tended to be robust, very accurate, and they are almost all converging around what they call a 99% chance of a landslide. And by landslide, as you have been summarizing, they mean a Labour majority of more than 200 in the House of Commons. As you noted, it could be the largest majority in almost 200 years. The Conservatives could be reduced. They could lose 2/3 of their seats, more than 2/3 of their seats, where they have probably in the low 100s. Some polls have them as low as 70, 75. The scale of this is unprecedented, but I think let's take a wider look at that. There are wider issues here in terms of what that landslide means. Does it mean, for example, that the Liberal Democrats, who of course were in coalition government in 2010, that they are resurgent, indeed that they are close to the Conservatives as the official opposition party? Does it mean that the Scottish Nationalist Party will hold on to their seats in Scotland? And does it mean for all the noise that Nigel Farage makes? And I do think he makes noise. I think the media too often pay too much attention to him. Does it mean that he at least gets a seat in Parliament where he can make more noise for the next few years? And then beyond that, here's the big issue. Even if there's a Labour landslide, what people are not talking about here is that the fundamental behind all the issues regarding our public services, regarding our economic downturn, in terms of being on the brink of recession, in terms of social issues, divisive issues, in terms of the hatred being spread about immigration, is Brexit. And even if Labour take power, Keir Starmer said yesterday that the UK will not even move back towards a single market with Europe in his lifetime, not in the next 5 years, but in his lifetime. So even if we get this Labour landslide, the long-standing problems of the UK, I think, are going to be here. In other words, it's going to be a very short honeymoon period for Labour.
Okay, very interesting. Talking about what Keir Starmer has said about Britain going back to the European Union, I think it might be correct to say that politicians are often known to change their stance once they return to power. So who knows? But let me take this to Ambassador Meera Shankar. Ambassador Shankar, it's always dicey, especially given the outcome of the Indian elections this time, to look into the crystal ball and make predictions, as Professor Lucas said. But by all accounts, it looks like the Tories are headed for a wipeout, and the win for Labour could be absolutely unprecedented and historic. Needless to say, there is a lot of interest here in India in the UK elections because the current Prime Minister has a strong India connection. However, Rishi Sunak has reportedly confided to his own inner circle that he fears losing his own seat in Richmond. According to you, ma'am, how significant is this UK election for the people of that country and for Europe in general? And how do you see India? How do you believe India is looking at it?
Well, for the UK, I think it's a very consequential election because, you know, after more than a decade and a half of Conservative government, it looks like there could be a change. And this change is not just like marginal. It promises to be epoch-making. According to the polls, it will be an unprecedented landslide. So Labour would have the majority to make changes. Now, there's a dilemma for Labour as well, because when it swung too far to the left, its electability went down because people didn't trust Labour. And Keir Starmer has tried to steer the party back to the centre and to reassure UK businesses that Labour will not be a radical party. It will change things. And so his program appears modest in terms of changes. And as the previous speaker said, the challenges that the UK faces post-Brexit, post the inflation and cost of living crisis caused by both Brexit and the war in Ukraine, and the crumbling public services, I think these are all issues which are going to be very difficult to deal with because the UK is already heavily in debt, and I think the Conservatives had also increased taxes to deal with that level of debt. So what the scope is to raise additional revenue to meet these challenges, I think is going to be difficult. But there are some interesting proposals on the table. For instance, Labour wants to renationalise the UK rail service, improve the National Health Service, also, take a slightly more enlightened policy with regard to immigration. But we have to see how that works out because their working class constituency is pretty much against immigration and was very much in support of Brexit. Now, you see the dilemma because recent polls show that actually the majority now is in favor of having remained in Europe rather than having exited Europe. But no political party wants to reopen the issue. They say, well, it's been done, we've walked out, now it's, dusted and settled.
The fact
So
of the
no
matter is that
political-
Britain is still reeling under the disastrous impact of Brexit. I think that is pretty safe to conclude. Ambassador Shankar, give me a moment. I'll come back to you very quickly, Professor Lucas, as we wrap up the discussion on, our first topic on the show. I want to ask you this. Given that cost of living and immigration have been major issues in this election, and anybody would agree that 14 years of being in office, that's a very, very long time for any political party. Many analysts say that this is going to be a vote against the Conservative Party and not so much for Labour. So my question is, do you believe that Keir Starmer would be able to rise to the challenges that the incoming government is going to face, restore the public's faith in the government, or do you believe he will end up wearing a crown of thorns?
Tell you what, I'll come back and talk to you in 6 months about that, because the proof will be in the pudding. Keir Starmer is a very, very competent man. He was Britain's lead prosecutor, was very effective in that role. As the ambassador mentioned, he's been very effective in moving Labour away from a very bad period in its party history, moving it back towards the center. He's a very capable man, but at least in opposition and during this election campaign, Labour has been very cautious. They've made a lot of statements about how they want to improve public services. They want to deal with the damage of the toxic language around immigration. They want to try to improve the economy, but they haven't really come out with that many specific defined proposals. Again, because until they get into power, I don't think they'll know the extent of the damage that has been done to the fundamentals of the British economy. I would say two things. I would say, first of all, it may take some time before we find out if they are effective in dealing with those issues, like providing a better health service, providing better transport, providing more affordable housing. But they can make an immediate difference in a language which is for a much more decent country, a much more tolerant country. Mr. Farage, in particular, the Reform Party, have been toxic and continue to be toxic at pitting Britain, against demonizing people from different faiths, different cultures, including people from India. But a lot of conservatives have been toxic as well as in doing that. And as we face the prospect that the Conservative Party might become more toxic and sway harder right after this election defeat, if Labour can actually say, we need unity rather than division, that in itself would be a good start in the country where I lived for 4 years.
It's quite interesting that Britain currently seems to be one of those few countries that is, in a sense, bucking the international trend and moving left, while most other countries seem to be moving right, going by what's happened recently in Europe. All right, I need to move on to my next big story, and I'll request my guest to stay on with me. All right, from the United Kingdom elections, let's now turn our focus to the United States, where there seems to be utter political chaos at the moment, at least in the Democratic ranks. With speculation exploding that he may be considering pulling out of the race following a disastrous performance in the presidential debate last week, US President Joe Biden, who is facing greater scrutiny than ever before, has unequivocally declared that he will not quit. I'm running, I'm the nominee of the Democratic Party, no one's pushing me out, I'm not leaving. Biden declared to his spooked campaign staff on a phone call on Wednesday. Later, Biden met 20 Democratic governors at the White House to try and prove that he still has the energy and mental acuity to win the upcoming presidential election and lead for another 4 years. On Friday, Biden will sit for an interview with ABC News. That's now shaping up as an event that could emerge as an even greater challenge than the CNN debate, given his desperate need to put in a nimble and forceful performance. Biden's every single public appearance will now be parsed for any slip-up or sign of vulnerability that supports the impression that Biden created for himself on the debate stage of a diminished commander-in-chief. But the tough emerging reality for the US president is that the assurances, shifting explanations and spin that his political aides have come up with don't seem to be working. The image of an incoherent, weak and struggling president was seared on the minds of millions of viewers a week ago. Attempts to explain his struggles in Atlanta are only refocusing attention on the core problem. Supermajorities of voters doubt that he's fit enough to serve a new term that would end when he's 86. On Wednesday, the White House picked up Biden's line that he was jet-lagged after 2 trips to Europe in early June. Given that the president had been back on US soil for over a week at the time of the debate, this only gave rise to fresh questions over whether he's up to the onerous demands of the presidency. The idea that delayed jet lag in combination with the cold that his aides said he also had could cause Biden to trail off in the middle of sentences and fail to make a coherent case on issues basic to his campaign did nothing to arrest his political slide. The result is that the focus now is on Biden's disintegrating campaign rather than the grave threat to democracy and America's political freedoms that the president warns is posed by Trump.
Is President Biden considering stepping down?
Absolutely not. And you heard, I believe, directly from the campaign as well.
Is the president telling people he's evaluating the race?
False. That is absolutely false. I saw that reporting. We were not given enough time to get back to that reporting, just a couple of minutes, and we asked the president. The president responded directly when asked about this question because we said that we would, and the president said it is absolutely false. That's coming directly from him.
And Korea, President Biden has always promised to tell the American people the truth. So can you be straight with us and the American people? Is the president clear-eyed about what it takes to stay in the race and what it would take for him to drop out?
The president is clear-eyed, and he is staying in the race. I don't have anything else beyond that. He's staying in the race. That is what the president is promised to do. That is what he wants to continue to work on the successes that he's had. His record is unprecedented record, and that is what the president is focused on, continuing to deliver for the American people.
Came together tonight to listen to President Biden tell us in his own words what his plans were. I'm here to tell you today, President Joe Biden is in it to win it. And all of us said we pledged our support to him because the stakes could not be higher. On the eve of the 4th of July celebration, we talk about how we transition under a monarchy and a tyranny that our founding fathers fought against, that we risk right now descending back into that very same place. We will stand with the president as we fight that force being Donald Trump. And together, we'll make sure that Americans know not just what Joe Biden did for all of us, and the list of what he did for my state of New York is extraordinarily long, but where he's going for the future and where he's going to take this country. We feel very confident in his abilities. We talked about the plan and how he's going to be very focused on issues that matter to Americans, and I felt very confident coming out of this meeting as well.
Okay, let me go back to Ambassador Meera Shankar at this point. Ambassador Shankar, the more explanations and spin that Biden aides offer, the worse it seems to get for the President of the United States of America. Of course, he is saying at the moment he is not going to quit the race. He's in it to win it. Biden continues to put up a brave front. But do you not believe that the Democratic Party may well have come to a point where they've been forced to consider requesting the president to step aside and maybe replace him with Vice President Kamala Harris? Last time you were on the show to discuss this, we talked about how the Democrats were panicking after the debate. Now we know that at least one Democrat has come out and publicly urged President Biden to step aside. That is Representative Lloyd Doggett. Do you believe it's getting worse and worse for President Biden?
Well, President Biden is fighting back at the moment. And, he has mobilized sections of the Democratic Party in his support, as you heard, with these governors whom he addressed. And it's still, the basic point is, since he has the delegates, until he decides to step down, the Democratic Party can't do anything because those are the procedures. I mean, he has the delegates tied up to be the nominee. So they have to persuade him to step down. I think, giving public ultimatums or demands perhaps would not be the best way to do this. And I think President Biden also went into a huddle with his family in Camp David, and from news reports, it seems, the family was in favor of his continuing to fight back. So I really don't know. It's a very, very difficult and critical stage for the Democratic Party.
I think they're in a very unenviable position, as I say every time, I think America itself is in a very unenviable position right now, given the choice that they're faced with today, Donald Trump or Joe Biden. That really is a very tough decision that Americans have to make on the 5th of November. But do you believe, ma'am, that if President Biden delivers a relatively much stronger performance in his upcoming interview with ABC News, which is scheduled for Friday, that's tomorrow, he may be able to salvage his prospects and come back somewhat from last week's disastrous debate? The worry for him and the Democrats is that poll after poll seems to suggest that backing for him is sliding.
See, President Reagan, if you go back, President Reagan also did very poorly in his first debate. He appeared sleepy and the polls were pretty bad for him. Then he came back from behind and won the election. So one can't rule out anything, but, clearly age is a factor for Biden. I mean, it's visible. I don't know to what extent he will be able to convey reassurance that, he's in fine fettle for the job. And that's what the American people need. It's not so much his policies or his capability or whatever, because he was, but it's just that, is he up to another 5-year term because of his age?
Absolutely. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the other day, the American people have the right to ask, was it an episode or is it a condition? The problem for Biden and the Democrats is that way too many Americans seem to think it is a condition and that President Biden is no longer fit for the highest office. What is the Democratic Party going to do next is the million-dollar question. But we leave it at that. Ambassador Meera Shankar, as always, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining me, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, time for us to take a quick break here on Global Lens, but don't go anywhere, because on the other side, we have an exclusive interview with Australia's High Commissioner to India, Philip Green.
Who am I?
Nobody can crack that mystery.
There is a certain expectation of me.
That's the only contradiction.
Life itself is stranger than fiction.
I was a perfectly normal person born in an abnormal world.
I really didn't understand why is it different.
Just imagine a child who is bullied every day.
Boys school में कुछ लड़का लोग मेरे साथ sexual abuse किए.
मुझे तेरे बारे में सब पता है.